As people around the globe embrace the technological revolution,
You've got whatever you want to know.
to widen their horizons and expand the freedom of expression, and as the world's superpowers dominate international 24-hour news,
This is London.
and internet giants monopolize the new media,
You've got to go through Google.
while a few newspaper moguls increase their grip on the old,
Shut up.
we ask, who controls the flow of information in the age of information? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. Global powers, state and corporate, are increasingly dominating the global media and the very information that is indispensable to freedom and democracy. Superpowers are using the airwaves to win over hearts and minds around the world, and since 2001 have focused their 24-hour news on the Arab world. Likewise, the world's biggest media corporations, like News Corp, General Electric, Viacom, and Disney, to name a few, are vying to mold government policies, consolidate power in search of profit, and in the process, block competition at the expense of pluralism of expression. But the front line of the new information wars is online, where the likes of Google, YouTube, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, and others are shaping the delivery and flow of information. Over the next hour, I shall discuss the influence of these giants on the future of media with my guests, Greg Dyke, former Director General of the BBC, Christine Ockrent, the head of France 24, and Professor John Owen, former head of CBC News, as well as Al Jazeera's host of Listening Post, Richard Gisberg. But first, a glimpse at how the world's leading nuclear powers are now battling for viewers 24 hours a day.
I know everybody here is on a 24-hour news cycle. I'm not.
He may not be, but the rest of the world is.
It's the new News Act. It's background.
Rolling news, 24/7 and 365.
The total amount of news output has gone up to exponentially.
But somehow, the more we watch, the less we really know.
The danger is that people actually trust their media.
But should we?
Tonight on CNN. Breaking news.
A scoop for CNN.
Infantry battalion from the Marines, as well as tanks.
The US Marines announced the start of the Battle for Fallujah, live and exclusive.
It's going to be a long night.
But that's the one true thing he said. The Fallujah campaign wouldn't actually start until 3 weeks later. CNN's scoop was in reality a deliberate piece of misinformation by the US government.
Thank you again, Lieutenant, for joining us from Fallujah.
A one-off aberration or something more troubling.
If you speak to most professional journalists, very few would say I engage in propaganda, but a lot of professional journalism is just that.
This is London.
Imperial powers have been speaking to the world since the earliest days of broadcasting.
You're tuned to the General Overseas.
The British government began the trend with the BBC World Service. Since 1932, it spent billions of taxpayers' pounds funding the broadcasts.
The BBC thinks that their reputation for integrity, for independence, for impartiality, for fairness, etc., 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 marks their news out as a distinctive proposition.
Coast Guard cutter Courier adds its voice to those of the world's free people.
And since the Second World War, the US government's Voice of America has preached the virtues of the American way in more than 50 languages around the clock and around the world.
The president says that the most powerful weapon it carries is truth.
But not in America itself, where it's banned as propaganda.
I think developing world populations are very quick to see whether foreign governments are producing complete propaganda.
But in the 1990s, affordable satellite technology broke the West's monopoly on the world's airwaves.
Space opened up for new channels because of digital technology. It led to every major broadcaster everywhere wanting a 24-hour network.
The launch of Al Jazeera in 1996 fired the first shots on what would become an international info war.
Hello and welcome those who just joined us at France 24.
Since then, the rest of the world's superpowers have all launched worldwide 24-hour channels. But how much real journalism is being broadcast?
I think you need to distinguish between 24-hour news services that set their stall out to be impartial, as opposed to organisations that may see their role as being more linked, if you like, to sort of propaganda.
Beijing started its 24-hour rolling news network to counter the lingering international public relations disaster of Tiananmen Square.
What's happening there is what's broadly known now as public diplomacy. It's governments finding new ways to reach out to populations beyond their shores.
The Kremlin funds Russia Today with the express aim of improving the country's image abroad.
But not all journalists blame Russia for the conflict.
Wherever its tanks may be doing the opposite.
Globally, audiences are braining up, they're not dumbing down. So the global audience for TV news is hardly more likely to get taken in by things that are really inspired by propagandist objectives than people in the developed West.
But ironically, their appetite for the raw material to do just that is working against them. Most of all TV pictures come from just 2 Western-based news agencies. So are today's 24-hour news channels, wherever they may be, really presenting different viewpoints? Or simply amplifying the same old one?
No matter what ideological perspective a broadcaster is associated with, everybody using 24-hour news all over the world is getting very much the same story.
We'll be back tomorrow. Until then, stay on Russia Today.
Greg Dyke, you're the former Director General of the BBC. Do you think complaints about British-American domination of 24-hour television are credible?
Clearly, the British, the Americans and then the British were the first in, but I don't think that means that it's domination. As you saw in the piece, I mean, there's all sorts of people now running international 24-hour news services.
And that's just over the last 5, 6, 7 years. But generally speaking, even the 2 most important news agencies remain to be British and American.
Yes. I'm not sure that, because to some extent that dominates the pictures. Whether that dominates what you're saying about the pictures, of course, is different. I think different countries have, the 24-hour news services have different criteria. Certainly at the BBC, the aim was to try to give an impartial perspective, but obviously it was from a British viewpoint of what was important and what mattered. And that must apply everywhere.
Christine Ocamp, you are the Chief Executive Officer of France 24. Let me ask you, you've complained before about British-American domination in 24-hour news, but what about France's domination in the Francophone world of television?
Well, I wouldn't dare complain about Anglo-American domination. I don't think that's the proper way to put it. CNN was the first in with 24 hours news, and it certainly was a very, Ted Turner, if there ever was a private entrepreneur, that's been him. So I wouldn't put it quite in those words, Marwan. Coming back to France 24, which is less than 3 years old, it broadcast in 3 languages, French, English, and Arabic. And our purpose is not to speak only to the Francophone part of the world. That's not our goal. Our goal, as Greg put it for the BBC, is to try and offer our viewpoint on world affairs and indeed produce original coverage on some stories, which is precisely what Al Jazeera has been trying to do over the years.
You certainly complained about how the Brits and the Americans tend to dominate the representation of the West and why France needs to have a voice. Do you think the West is overheard or underheard in the world?
I think that historically the technology of news gathering and particularly broadcasting have originated in the West. And that's what has been so fascinating about the rise of Al Jazeera, is that indeed it's been more of a north-south balance, so to speak, which Al Jazeera has helped produce. But I don't think we should feed that sort of confusion, you know, between old empires and eventually new ones. And I recall, you know, the very vivid discussions at the very birth of Al Jazeera English as to whether your channel should be a strict copy of Al Jazeera in Arabic with the same content, the same ideology, so to speak. So I think we have to be clear about what we're all up to.
I would like to take this to Professor Jero, and you're a professor of international journalism, and you were once director of news at CBC, the Canadian television. Do you think the superpower monopoly over 24-hour news has been broken?
I think absolutely it has been. And again, talking about this channel, Al Jazeera English, not in terms of audience figures, because again, in audience figure terms, it's hard to know, depends on what part of the world we're talking about. But in terms of Al Jazeera English's decision to go after the South and focus on the South more than the North, I think that's provided a new paradigm for coverage. It doesn't mean that it's dominating the world, hardly is. But things are shifting all the time. And a lot of these things are going to happen through the internet, thanks to groups like Live Station, a little online service on your laptop in which I can watch any channel I want to, mostly in the world, by just clicking. I can go to Russia Today, Al Jazeera. Where you'll see the differences, though, is when one country is at risk. When Georgia and Russia are fighting each other, then you want to see what Russia Today says, see what CNN says. It depends on where in the world things are happening in terms of what that superpower cares about in terms of its own coverage.
Do you think it's paradoxical that those very nuclear powers, the superpowers of the world, the veto-carrying members of the Security Council, are the ones to launch into English 24-hour television, like China, like France, like Russia, increasingly regional powers like Iran, Press TV?
But the real issue is, what do they watch when it matters? I mean, it's one thing to launch a television channel, but do you think Vladimir Putin really watches Russia Today? No, he wants to know what BBC is saying, what CNN is saying, what Al Jazeera is saying.
Christine, I want to take this back to you before I go to Greg about how much do you see France 24 a reflection of France's foreign policy, of France's culture, or the way it's like to be seen around the world?
Well, France 24 certainly intends to be a reflection of our culture, but not so much of our policies. We're not the tool, you know, of the French government, although we're a public channel. The same as the BBC is not really the tool of the Foreign Office.
But what I noticed, Christine, is that, for example, your coverage of Lebanon, I've noticed an incredible symmetry between Paris's position and France 24's position on the question of who's right and who's wrong in Lebanon.
Well, that's a very interesting example, Marwan, because we certainly have another way to try and explain the extricacies of Lebanese politics than Al Jazeera does, and certainly Al Jazeera in Arabic. And I think we would be probably, you know, closer to the BBC in that respect. But again, we are adamant about explaining what our values are, not our policies, our values. And I think that's
I want to discuss the whole
point of having a diversity of 24-hour news channels.
I want to discuss that very particular issue with you a bit later, but I would like to go back to Greg. Greg, tell me, you've complained after the last Gulf War about how American media, in fact, is very much at times reflective of American official position.
Well, I think the Iraq War was a particular instance when I think if the Bush government, after 9/11, and the Bush government's view, the Bush administration's view, was that if you're not on our side, you're the enemy. I mean, I remember being in the States.
And the American networks did the same thing?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, I was amazed. I mean, I expected it of Fox News. You knew their political position. I was amazed when I was in the States at that time to watch CNN for a couple of days and just be... CNN went to war. The American networks went to war. And I think basically the position was they were scared that if you didn't get up and go to war, you had a difficult time with government and possibly with the American people at that time.
I've seen two researchers, Greg, that said BBC's coverage featured only 2% against the war. How do you explain that?
I haven't seen those figures, but I would doubt.
Media tenor, for example.
I have difficulty to believe that. I mean, the BBC. I was laying down the policy about our coverage of the war, which meant that I was very unpopular with our own government, because at times of crisis, governments want their media to support them. It's as simple as that. And the job of the media is to question them. The point is, you're trying to reflect your society's view of a particular set of events, which is different from society to society. Now, when you get something like the Iraq War, it's much harder. The pressure we were under was enormous. Our job was to fight that. I think the American networks and the American news services failed to do that, and I think they failed.
Yeah. It also triggered a number of satellite televisions around the world broadcasting in Arabic, and we want to see that report before we get back and discuss it.
Colonial wars used to be fought like this. Now, the most powerful nations on Earth are deploying a more insidious weapon in the Middle East. 24-hour news.
We are witnessing a form of cultural imperialism, because every country would like to have a share and influence in the Arab world.
The Middle East is a vital strategic constituency in the global village.
The Middle East is a crucible, if you like, for some pretty bad things which are spreading out around the world in terms of, terrorism, armed conflict, general social disruption.
Which may be why the French and British governments are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on adding Arabic language rolling news channels to their existing broadcasts.
هنا لندن BBC أهلا بكم.
Well, after the invasion of Iraq,
soon a new television service will begin providing reliable news and information across the region.
America launched a whole new network to sell its vision to the Middle East.
Al-Bara is a laughingstock channel meant to provide propaganda in favor of US intervention in Iraq.
But as competition for influence and the oil that can buy heats up, new empires are joining the game. Last month, Chinese Central Television launched a new Arabic language channel.
The channel, covering 22 Middle East countries and nearly 300 million people, will greatly enhance our global influence.
Meanwhile, Russia's 24-hour news operation has hired 500 staff to interpret the Kremlin's worldview for an Arabic audience.
Whereas once upon a time it was the Cold War, now it's absolutely the Middle East.
But how trusted is state-sponsored journalism by its target audience?
They would like to have this aura of credibility spread around the media outlet. So we are impartial, we are fair and balanced. Practically, this is only a propaganda, because they are there to serve their own countries and the commercial interests of their respective countries.
The world's great powers have tried to use journalism to win Arab hearts and minds ever since Napoleon took an Arabic printing press on his campaigns in Egypt 200 years ago. 24-hour news may be the new smart weapon of choice, but is it really hitting its target?
Christine Ockrent, back in Paris. Since Napoleon brought printing to the East, up until France 24 started broadcasting in Arabic, do you think you won more hearts than you lost in the Middle East?
Why would we have lost? We broadcast the same news and the same programs in 3 languages, French, English and Arabic. 10 hours of Arabic so far. We plan to expand more next year. The idea, again, is to expose in Arabic, which is a major language in the world. And we also, in France particularly, and in Europe, have large minorities of Arab-speaking people. Our goal is, again, to explain our views, to expose our viewers to contradictory debates, so as to enable them to broaden their views.
The thing is, Christine,
and so
that
we're perfectly legitimate to speak Arabic the same way that we speak English.
John, it seems to be that some of these superpowers behave like pyromaniac firemen. They launch wars, and then they search for love and to be understood in the Arab world.
Or they're just not very effective. If you take Al-Hura,
that's the American Arab.
The American attempt, that in its 5 years, it spent $500 million. It has a 3% audience. It spends about as much yearly as Jazeera and Al Arabiya do. And it's put on Nasrallah, it's put on Holocaust deniers. It's not even good propaganda. So it is completely incompetently run, and you have to ask yourself, what is that doing to advance the cause of more sympathy toward an American point of view in the Arabic world? I also don't understand, to be honest, why the BBC launched at this late date the Arabic service when it's clear that Jazeera and Arabiya are acceptably very good practice journalism that the world would recognize as universally outstanding. Why is it needed?
It's after my time, but when I was there, the discussions were going on. I mean, the decision was taken in the end to close the services in Eastern Europe, by and large, and use the money to launch in the Arab world. I think it's because the Foreign Office believes that as does the foreign affairs departments of almost every government, knows that is the area that is important.
It's attached to the foreign policy agenda.
Oh, it's certainly attached to the foreign policy agenda. There's no doubt about that. Why come out? Why stop broadcasting in Eastern Europe now? Because Eastern Europe is no longer an enemy.
But what amazes me, Greg...
But that doesn't mean that the service is not a fair and honest, good journalism. And I think your point is a right one. I mean, I looked at Al Jazeera in some detail at one time and found that actually this wasn't a piece of propaganda. This was a very respectable news service. And that seems to me the criteria. Is it a respectable news service or is it a piece of propaganda?
But look at China. China is having its 24-hour service. We said France, Russia, Iran, the United States, as well as the UK.
Well, now, in my time at the BBC, most of our relationship with China was spent trying to keep our service going, because the service that only went into the hotels in China, as soon as we put on anything that offended the Chinese, it would come off again.
What amazes me about all of that, Greg, is that the Arabs are sick and tired of their state televisions, right? So now superpowers are coming from the outside with their own state televisions broadcasting to the Arab world.
I think they're less obvious.
Less obvious, but...
They're less obvious. They're less obviously state-based. Now, some of them are just state-funded, but are actually trying to demonstrate what I would call democratic style of journalism.
Christine, you're laughing, but I want to take this to you because you said something before that I feel uncomfortable here from Al Jazeera to quiz you on it, but I'm going to do that anyway. Tell me, please, I watched France 24 coverage over the weekend to do a summary of the Middle East in last week. It had a couple of stories about Lebanon, Yemen, but the opening story of in a week that featured Somalia's violence, Iraqi violence, the Libyan affair, and so on and so forth, it featured lingerie in Gaza. How does that serve French understanding in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not familiar with lingerie in Gaza, certainly not as much as you are. But frankly, I would be very surprised if that would have been on the top of a news bulletin. It may have been more on a feature
No, on the summary, of the week.
But again, I don't think you can, I mean, unless you think that we French are obsessed with lingerie, which maybe
of course not. Of course
something
not.
else. But seriously, we are, I think, a credible, legitimate news organization. To cover the latest events in Gaza, for instance, we were one of the very, very few foreign networks to have our correspondent in Gaza. But I really argue the fact that you seem to play down what we try to do in Arabic, which is, again, to offer our Arab viewers another approach on world and Middle East affairs. And I think that all contributes to, you know, freedom of speech, and also just to allow every viewer to form his or her point of view.
Christine,
and that's what we're here for.
Well, before we run out of time, John, do you think that counter-propaganda is propaganda?
Well, everyone is trying to promote a message. It really depends on the people at the receiving end. Do they see it as propaganda? Do they just simply see it as an alternative point of view? I mean, I think Christine's point is valid, that what's wrong with another view of Lebanon from a French network-financed position. There's a way to find counter-propaganda by just simply switching the dial or flicking another channel on.
On that note, Christine Ockrent, thank you so much for joining us from Paris. We're going to need to take a break. But when we come back, Listening Post's Richard Gisbert will join us to discuss the influence of corporate media and web giants on journalism and the flow of information.